What is the #1 problem facing our rivers and streams within the Mississippi watershed? Is it agricultural runoff? Is it overfishing, mismanagement, or is it invasive species? So, what is the #1 problem facing our rivers and streams within the greater Mississippi watershed? So this literally took me probably 20 hours of research, right? Like, I mean, 27, so that's, for me, that's like a week. That's like a week of all my free time, which really isn't free time. I just have to make time to do it. So recently I put out some polls that some of you guys answered. Now, what I didn't tell you guys is that I've actually put these polls everywhere, and I've put them on different Facebook groups, I've put them on YouTube, and I've put them on catfishing forums and river, just basically just any outdoor forums. And I think I've done like 10 or 12 of these. What I was expecting to see was a wide range of different people's opinions coming together, and there would be one or two, maybe two, but probably one clear victor. That's not what happened at all. Actually, it was almost pretty even across the board. And when I say even, I mean I gave 4 options, and it was basically either low 20s or high 20s percentage wise for each one. So basically a quarter across the board. So there wasn't a single one, whether it was mismanagement, invasive species, agricultural runoff, overfishing, all of these things, like all of them were pretty much chosen pretty equally. So there was no general consensus that one was greater than the other. So this is when I started doing quite a bit of digging. So let's just start with the first one, right? Let's just start with agricultural runoff, and what does that actually mean? So when we talk about agricultural runoff, what we're essentially saying is like the first things that come to mind, almost everybody's mind, are things like chemicals that are being sprayed onto farmland and that are then washing out into the rivers and streams. That actually makes up a pretty small part of what the agricultural runoff pollution and pollutants are. Like, it's a very tiny part of it. And as far as our rivers and streams go, those really don't have a tremendous effect on our freshwater rivers and streams. Now, when you start looking at things like phosphorus, nitrates, and potassium, these are things that are commonly found in fertilizers. These things will actually run off into our rivers and streams and do cause problems, but not usually for the wildlife that lives in the rivers and streams. That's more of a human problem. Like, it actually affects us pretty negatively if those levels get too high. Where does these things really make an impact? Lakes, reservoirs, ponds, and the ocean. These 4 places, those nutrients are incredibly damaging to those environments for a number of different reasons, right? So let's just take fertilizers, for example. When you take fertilizers, and let's say fertilizer leaks into a reservoir, and maybe this reservoir doesn't flow particularly well, and so you've got a lot of algae that builds up, and because that's what it does. That's what these fertilizers do. They promote plant life. And you say, well, some algae is good, Dave. Yeah, it is. Some algae is good. Too much algae starts a chain reaction that causes a whole lot of the functions that promote life in these places to completely break down. Okay, so algae, for example, blooms into more algae. And that's really bad. And the reason why is because that algae then dies and starts a cycle of a continuous nitrate factory, basically, which doesn't really help itself. It's almost impossible to reverse these problems without taking significant steps to eliminate all of it. One of the big problems with algae, it chokes out other aquatic plant life. It turns the water very turbid, which does not allow sunlight to penetrate into the depth, which means all of the aquatic life that lives below there is going to suffer. Okay, so like the things that live in your natural vegetation, they die. Why? Because the vegetation dies. There's no sunlight getting to it. The proper photosynthesis doesn't take place, so oxygen's not being released. It also lowers oxygen levels due to a number of other reasons. One of those reasons being is when dead and rotting, decaying matter, whether it's plankton or some type of algal life or plants or anything, you know, leaves, whatever, that fall in there and float and go down to the bottom, there's actually a bacterial breakdown process that's going on there that consumes a tremendous amount of oxygen, pulling oxygen out of the water. And this is how you have, most of the time when a pond or a lake turns over, the oxygen, the lack of oxygen is what actually kills the fish. So that's basically why algae is a terrible, terrible thing. And agricultural runoff can play a role in that. But this video is about rivers and streams. So it doesn't really affect them that much until it gets out to the ocean, and then it plays a whole nother nightmare of a mess, which kills coral, destroys ecosystems and so on and so forth. But what's actually the problem with agricultural runoff in rivers and streams? Well, the number one pollutant, people don't really think of pollutants. When you think of a pollutant in the water, you think of things like CO, chemicals, whatever, that are going in there, and you think, oh, that's what's killing these invertebrates and all these little, these smaller fish and these amphibians and stuff that really form up the basis, the plankton, everything that forms the basis of life in that entire system. It's actually silt, right? So, for example, no-till farming, right? So what happens is farmers, instead of tilling up the soil, which basically breaks up the soil and allows plants to get at those nutrients that are locked in that soil, they basically just plant them, and all those nutrients that are locked in the soil stay locked in the soil. So in order to compensate for that, they have to put fertilizers on them. Well, what that does over time is the ground gets hard. The ground gets very hard, okay? And when the ground gets hard, water runs off of it. It doesn't soak down in it and replenish things like underground aquifers, which then keeps our rivers more regulated, right? That doesn't happen. The water just runs off of the surface, and it takes topsoil and it takes sediments and everything down with it. Here's the problem with that. And you think, it's a muddy river, so what? Well, here's the big problem. So in a lot of the little creeks and tributaries and stuff that feed these big rivers, you have a lot of rock bottom places where you have invertebrates that hide under these little rocks and these little pebbles. I'm sure you guys have all seen little creeks with tiny little rocks, and that basically makes up the bottom of that creek. The problem is when a bunch of sediments settle in around those crevices, that basically kills all those little invertebrates. It also doesn't allow fish that use those rocks. That is incredibly important to their habitat for those little guys to spawn and reproduce and make a whole nother generation of fish. When silts and sands and all kinds of dirt and debris get down into those crevices, those processes are no longer applicable for those animals and they die, right? And those little invertebrates and the plankton and stuff that's in the water, those feed the fish. And if they manage to make it to their adult stage, they then become insects, fly out of the water, and then they're food for birds, reptiles, everything. That's one of the reasons why you start to see a breakdown, you start to see a decline in species. That's the number one problem with agricultural runoff. It's not the chemicals in our rivers and streams that's hurting our rivers and streams. Okay, because those are getting washed out and they're going down in the ocean, and they are causing a whole other heap of problems. The number one problem that's contributing to the decline of our river systems is, in fact, sediment. So recently I actually spoke to a few biologists, and I'll get to that a little bit later in the video. One of the things that he spoke to me about was that it is perhaps that much of these nitrates and phosphorus that are going into our river systems is actually promoting phytoplankton growth, which in turn creates more food and forage for the Asian carp species, which could be a reason that is leading to these fish coming up into these tributaries and actually being able to grow to enormous sizes and reproduce incredibly fast, which I thought was hugely interesting. That agricultural runoff is not only playing a devastating role with our smaller species, it's actually helping our larger invasive species, which in turn is again another nail in the coffin. So let's talk about overfishing for a second. I put that one in there because I think that there's a lot of people that think that overfishing is contributing widely to the decline of our rivers and our tributaries from the greater Mississippi watershed. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I don't think so. I don't think overfishing is a problem at all. I think given the problems that our rivers face today that they've never faced before, overfishing is now relative. It's a relative answer. It's always been pretty much the same. Like, are you overfishing or are you not? But when you add in a ton of problems, there's times when almost some fishing can be overfishing. There's almost times when anyone fishing at all can be overfishing, right? So like when you have so many problems that are having such a detrimental effect, and then you throw on top of that, you haven't changed any of your fishing regulations to accommodate those things, then it becomes overfishing. Even though you're doing the same thing you did and your family has done for 60 years, and you're not doing any more, you're not doing any less, you're not doing any more, but it's worse now, that could technically make it overfishing. This is one of the reasons why I'm not a fan anymore of trot lining and limb lining and bank lining. I just think that it's too much. I think it's too much given the problems that we have today. In my river particularly, it's one of the most overfished fisheries in the entire state of Indiana. and there's not a single solitary thing being done about it. I go on that river probably well over 100 times a year. I see hundreds. I could take you right now. I bet I could take you right now and show you 10 trot lines that are not marked, that are completely, and matter of fact, I can't show you one that is. I can't show you a bank line that's marked properly, but I can show you hundreds of those. I can show you probably 24 limb lines. None of them are marked properly. There is no accountability, and there is no policing of these things. None. I see that that's a huge problem. I'm not going to spend any more time on it. I've said my piece about it. I just think times have changed, and we need to change with them. Our regulations need to change with them. Let's talk about invasive species for a moment. I'm really only going to talk about 4, and I'm really only going to talk about 2 of them. I'm going to mention a third one. Let's just start with the grass carp. They're easy. The reason why grass carp are detrimental is because, 1, they eat all the vegetation. They were released back in the 60s in order to do this. Some of them got loose, and they have since populated the entire Mississippi watershed. The problem with these things is they can breed at an unbelievable rate. They're tremendous, tremendous procreators, right? Like, these things they can reproduce. And the problem is they eat about 50% of the food that they take in. They don't even use, right? It just is, they just crap it out. And that wouldn't be such a problem, but they eat way more than we can actually provide for them to do. So they've been used a lot to clean algae, even though they don't really eat algae. But they use them a lot to clean out things like hydrilla, which is an invasive species of aquatic plant life that lives here in the United States that we're trying desperately to get a hold of. Grass carp are really, really good at getting rid of hydrilla. Like, they're probably the best natural solution, except for the fact you can't stop them from eating the native plants too, because they'll eat them all. They don't care. They're totally indiscriminate. They don't give a crap. So that's one of the reasons why they're a problem. They also crap a lot, which lowers the water quality, as you can imagine, tremendously. They do a lot of disturbing of sediments as well, which also makes the water more turbid, less sunlight penetration, lower oxygen levels. It's not good. But things like grass carp are bad, black carp are bad, but they're not nearly as bad as silver carp and bighead carp. The reasons why this is the case is mostly because forage competition with our native species, predominantly our bait fish. Now, when I started looking into this, I didn't realize how much I didn't know about Asian carp. There's actually a ton of information out there about them, and I learned a lot. But there's a lot we don't know about their behaviors, because some of their behaviors that they exhibit here, they don't exhibit in their native home range in Asia. They just don't. Like jumping out of the water, they don't do that there. They don't. That is strictly a US and North America phenomenon. All right, so I want to dive off into these Asian carp just a little bit more. First of all, they can lay up to 1 million eggs, like 1 million eggs a year. One of them. Just one. 1 million. They grow about 25 centimeters, which is like 12 inches in their first year. It's not very long after that they grow to enormous sizes, which basically puts them out of the food range of most of our native predators. Most of the time when you're trying to control a species, you control them when they're small. Very small, teeny tiny, because there's a ton of predators that are willing to eat them. The problem is these things grow incredibly fast in great quantities, and our native predators, it's only down to just a few of them that are able to actually do anything to these numbers, and they really can't. We don't have enough. We don't have enough flatheads. We don't have enough northern pike. We don't have enough giant blue cats. We don't have enough alligator gar, which are in fact historically native to southern Indiana. But the Ohio River, for example, is absolutely loaded with Asian carp. The hardest hit bodies of water, and this is what I was trying to explain to the biologists that I was speaking to, the hardest hit places are going to be your smaller tributaries. And the reason why is because in these bigger river systems, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, okay, these river systems are huge. So fish and bait fish and things like that compete with these fish can just move out. Right? If there's not enough oxygen available in this area, because there's literally hundreds of thousands of these fish nearby, they can just move to another area. In our smaller tributaries, the river that I fish averages about 4.5 to 6 feet deep all year long, and that's if it's staying pretty regular. Like right now, we're in a total drought. That's why you guys haven't seen any content from that river. It's because it's so low. It's this deep. Everywhere, all over the river, it's this deep. The fish are all moving down into deeper water, into bigger water. Those fish, though, don't have anywhere to go. They leave. right? There's nowhere, they can't just go deeper. They can't just move to the next hole. They have to leave the area, okay? Because not only because of oxygen, but also poor water quality, as well as their bait is gone. The problem with Asian carp, and I've showed you guys how to do this on my channel before earlier, is you can actually catch these things in the mouth with things like swim baits, for example. The reason why is because they don't like bait fish. So every single one of these that I've ever caught, I caught them in the mouth. Every single one that I've ever caught, it was a bee. I've caught them in the mouth on swim baits because they're trying to kill them. They're trying to kill your bait because they don't like them. So they push our bait out of their traditional bait holes, which then in turn pushes our regular native fish out of their regular holes. That is another huge problem, which doesn't really affect larger bodies of water and deeper areas of our river. It just so happens that I live in a 40-mile stretch that averages about 3.5 to maybe 5-6 foot deep. That's very unfortunate for me. So let's talk about the fourth one, and I kind of just threw this one in there just to see how many people would actually put it down, and quite a few people did. Basically just mismanagement. I've had a big stink for a long time over spending. Like, for example, in my area, we have a couple of state parks, and my state spends millions of dollars raising rainbow trout to full adult size, which is like 12 inches long, and turning them loose in these creeks in these state parks. They don't reproduce, they don't even stay, they leave immediately, and they don't really contribute at all. They don't add anything to the ecosystem. They only take from the ecosystem. They're only consuming, and they're not actually being productive and putting like new fry back into the system to make more food and forage for everything else. They're not actually contributing. They're leeching off of the current system. This costs millions of dollars, and after looking at the state of the carp epidemic, this plague that we have that's sort of just thrust upon my section of river, but everybody like within the Mississippi watershed is dealing with this. But it was just so heartbreaking coming to the realization that my children will never understand and see the river the way that I got to see it, the way that I got to enjoy it. So I decided to write some biologists. He gives me a very automated sort of response and sends me on to the next guy after proclaiming that he'd really only been in the job for like 4 months. So he wasn't going to help me anyways. I've been on that river for over 30 years. So the second guy I got sent to was actually the big rivers fisheries biologist. And I pretty much got a similar response. He was a little bit more, I'm not real sure. Like, I don't know if these guys, like, they were very just automated responses. Like, you could tell that these guys were really like, I just want to get this conversation over with. And they were referring to a creel report, and I was referring to a creel report, which I'm going to do a video about. I'm going to talk about what a creel report is and so on and so forth. But anyways, and the numbers within this creel report, these guys weren't really having anything. And I think they were misinterpreting, or they were trying to like purposefully offset the whole conversation by saying things like, I don't know, like I didn't even talk about overfishing, for example, but they all brought that up. I never once said anything about overfishing. I think these were just very automated responses, right? Just get this out there to the public. This is our official stance. So then I finally get to the third guy. And this guy is the former Big Rivers Fisheries guy, right? He did that for years. I got more information out of this guy than I did the other two, probably 10 times combined. This guy was a little bit more, like he was willing to engage. He's actually now tasked with I think they call it a COPI. Like, that's the new name for these Asian carp. But he's now tasked with, he's like the Asian carp task force leader or whatever, like coming up with solutions on how we end this problem, not end it, but actually get it under control, right? And basically he explains to me that their number one priorities, their number one goal is going to be damage control. Like, they're essentially looking at incentivizing commercial fishing. They're incentivizing a processing center. I guess there's a massive processing center in Kentucky, and that's what he was alluding to, that something on that level that's going to give people a reason to actually go get these fish and build an industry around it and keep their numbers contained. Throughout the entire tenure that these things have existed here, that where they've actually been a problem, commercial fishing does seem to be the one thing that does keep them in check. Okay, it is even believed that their numbers are reduced by 90% of what they formerly were before commercial fishing actually took a hold of them. That's scary if you think about it, because there's a lot of them now. I don't know how you're going to commercially fish my river. I don't know how you're going to commercially fish it. It's very shallow. It's got a lot of debris. Netting would be a nightmare in my river, but who knows? Maybe they can do that. So yeah, the state spends millions and millions of dollars raising rainbow trout in these very highly specialized hatcheries that are extremely expensive. There's a ton of overhead because these things got to have unbelievable filtration systems, food involved, you know, the employees that it takes to run these facilities, the biologists, everything involved. I mean, you're talking millions of dollars. So they can put a few thousand rainbow trout in Spring Mill Lake a year. And there's a few other places around the state. Guess what? They do it every year, multiple times a year. They're dumping out tens of thousands of these things. But why? They don't contribute, especially when you could just take that money and put it into habitat. You could put it into stocking programs. And when I mentioned that to one of the biologists, he was like, well, we don't normally stock rivers. And I was like, I wasn't talking about stocking rivers. Like, you don't stock rivers. You just leave them alone, right? Like, you just leave them alone. You stop putting bad things into them and they do better. And I was trying to explain to them that this had nothing to do with overfishing. It had very little to do with things like agricultural runoff. It has everything to do with species displacement. These fish are just being replaced. Our native fish are just being replaced. It is estimated that in our rivers today, in the United States, that 9 out of every 10 pounds of fish is an Asian carp. Think about that. Every 9 out of 10 pounds of fish is an Asian carp. That's how many more fish are in the rivers today. I was trying to convey that. They weren't having it. And I don't think they took me seriously. Or I don't know. I don't know how much time these people actually spend on the water. I have no idea. I'm sure they're excellent scientists. They're excellent biologists. I don't know. I just don't know what their workload and what their work schedule looks like. I don't know that they're spending the amount of time that a lot of people are on that river. There is most of the places in that river, you cannot go 100 yards without running into a huge school of Asian carp. And when I say a huge school, I'm talking hundreds of them. But instead of taking steps to improve habitat for native fish and to come up with new solutions and maybe like paying, if it means paying commercial fishermen to go after these fish, which is actually proven to be a pretty good way to do it, because when you pay the commercial fishermen to go do it, their catch is usually free to the public. You can just go get it if you want to go get it. Like, they just literally pull up and go get it if you want to. And you can use it for fertilizer. You can use it in animal feed. You can use it for whatever. There's a number of things that you can do with these, and they're being used all over the United States. This is what they're doing with them, and it's been very successful. Like, take a little bit of that trout money and give it to them. Or take all of that trout money and put it into stocking programs. Put it into habitat. Put it into anything. I don't care. Put it into research and development. Do something with that money that's going to benefit the entire ecosystem, right? Like, all of freshwater. Let's preserve the species we have. Don't add species to it. Like, okay, take walleye, for example. Walleye are a cool fish. I think they're awesome. Yellow perch, another cool fish. I think they're cool. They're cool way up north. They're not really cool here. I live in southern Indiana. When people think of Indiana, they think of the north. I'm about an hour away from Kentucky. I have a whole lot more climate-wise in common with Tennessee than I do the northern third of my state. Like, it's warmer. It's almost as warm here in southern Indiana as it is in Tennessee. There's almost no difference, right? Walleyes don't reproduce here. They don't do well here. Yellow perch, they don't reproduce here. They don't do well here. Northern pike, muskie, again, they don't reproduce here and they don't do well here. But my state still stocks them. There is not anywhere in Indiana that is really considered a good fishery. There's some that are okay, that you can go and you might have a day. Chances are you're not gonna, but you might. And most people can remember days this year where they had a good day, had a great day. But there's really no destination places in Indiana where people go and they say, man, I can't wait to come back here next year and fish it again. There's nowhere in Indiana like that. Nowhere, right? Like, we just don't have places like that. We don't have any really good fisheries. It's because we're too busy spending money, in my opinion, on stupid crap like rainbow trout, walleye that don't reproduce. They have walleye tournaments here where they go out with like 45 boats and they catch 3 fish. And usually none of them are keepers. That's my state. They spend millions every year on this stuff, trying to build Indiana as like this new walleye refuge. Like, we're gonna bring in all these places. No, you're not. Not when you got Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, all of these places. And Iowa and Nebraska aren't even really good walleye states either, but they're way better than this place. Way better. But Indiana's trying to bill us as such, and we never will be. We're just maybe in the northern part of the state, but they're stocking them in the south like they're going to do something. It's terrible. It really is just, in my opinion, it's really just bad management. So that's the 4 problems that I see. And that's kind of a broad explanation of all of them. Me personally, I happen to think that invasive species are the #1 problem. But that doesn't take away from the other problems. The other problems just compound onto that. Overfishing, in my opinion, has never been a problem. It's only now becoming a problem because our species are facing so many more problems that they weren't facing 30 years ago. When my grandfather was fishing that river, they weren't facing those problems. Not in any big significant way, but now they are. And now overfishing is just another facet of it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If I left anything out, I'm very sorry. If you've got any questions or comments, go ahead and go on down to that comment section and put them in there. I respond to every one of you, and I really appreciate you guys.